We're going to take just a few seconds because people are still kind of coming on. And so we'll wait just for under a minute, but I want everyone to be able to get into the room and get comfortable. You can get that last sip of coffee or whatever you do. I'm very excited about this evening's program. Well, I can't wait. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Joel Hunter, and I'm a member of the Holocaust Memorial Resources and Education Center of Florida's. I'm a member of the board of directors. Our mission is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community, free not only from anti-Semitism, but every form of prejudice and bigotry. Personally, I'm heart deep in this mission. I have been a pastor for over 50 years now. But I entered in through the civil rights movement. So I've always had this heart for vulnerable communities, communities that were being left out and marginalized and persecuted. At the same time, I was a history major, specifically had a fascination for World War II. And so my interest and passion partly was about the Holocaust and the dynamics. And the first time I visited Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, I was saying to the panel, my heart was just, I could hardly get through it. So we're here together on Yom HaShoah tonight with the worldwide community. We reflect even more deeply than usual and remember the over 6 million lives, including 1.5 million children that were murdered in the Holocaust. We also honor those who risked their lives to save their friends and their neighbors and strangers. I'm very excited to introduce to you our guide for this evening. It's my honor to introduce Marc Pollick. Now I'm going to read this because this is too important a man for me to mess up freelancing. And so let me read this. Marc has an extensive career in academic Holocaust studies, working with 1986 Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel. He was a founding director of the Zachor Institute for Holocaust Studies and founded the Elie Wiesel Institute for Humanitarian Studies. In 1997, Marc founded the Giving Back Fund, a nonprofit that encourages and facilitates charitable giving by pro athletes and celebrities, existing nonprofits, and all who truly desire to give back. In the 1980s, Marc traveled with students, teachers, and survivors to visit concentration camps on a program he developed called Journeys of Conscience. Tonight, he will moderate an incredible panel of leaders who have traveled similar journeys. Before I pass this program over, I'd like to read a quote for you all by Marc Pollick. If the world is ever to be made better, it will be made better by people who have the strength to visit Auschwitz and leave there and take the memory of those experiences and somehow go back and make a difference. Thank you so much, Marc. I now pass the program to you.
Thank you so much, Joel. I am so honored to be able to be a part of this tonight for so many reasons. First of all, Joel and I share a hometown, which we just found out. We're both from the Midwest. We're both from Cleveland. I've known Lisa for many years. I met her in Cleveland, but mainly because it feels like my life has come full circle. My very first job, as Joel mentioned, out of graduate school, was creating and founding the Holocaust Center in Miami. I was the youngest person ever named to a major city to direct a major city Holocaust Center. And what's interesting about that is that as soon as I got to Miami, I met this remarkable woman from Maitland, Florida, named Tess Wise. And I was just so excited when we were in the green room to find out that she's still alive. She's a Holocaust survivor, and she was instrumental in founding all those years ago, more years than I care to remember, in founding the Holocaust Center that I'm speaking at now. And we did many programs together, and I had many wonderful conversations with Tess. And so this is very special for that reason alone. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, and you're going to hear some amazing stories from them that I think will touch you deeply, I'd like to say a word about the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington. Those of you who are old enough to remember, and that's not everybody on this call, but if you were alive when the museum was being built, there was a raging debate in this country about why are we having a Holocaust museum, not only in the United States, but at the very epicenter of our nation's civic landscape, on the Mall in Washington, D.C., for a crime that was not perpetrated by Americans. Americans weren't victims, and it wasn't in America. And it was a very spirited debate, and it had, good arguments on both sides. And it went back and forth until a very famous columnist in the Washington Post named George Will, on March 10th, 1983, wrote what I consider to be one of the finest articles ever written. And I'm holding it here. It's almost 40 years old. He entitled it Holocaust Museum Antidote for Innocence. I don't know if you could see it, but in the article, and the article itself stopped the debate in its tracks. He said, it's true that the Holocaust wasn't an American event, but it's also true that Americans, more than anyone, need to be involved in understanding the Holocaust, that we see ourselves as a moral leader around the world, and that we are, in the article, he talks about us being a mentally soft republic. We don't build death camps in America. We don't have world wars that are fought on our land in America. And he said, for those reasons, it's more important than ever for a Holocaust museum to be at the very center of our civic life, so that it teaches our citizens what happens when unbounded evil goes unchecked. I'm going to read you the last sentence of his article. I commend it to you. You should read the whole article. But the last sentence is, the Holocaust Museum, located at the epicenter of our collective life, can be a mind-opening reminder of the furies beyond our shores. The museum is needed because nothing in nature is more remarkable or more dangerous than the recuperative power of innocence in a liberal society. So I strongly believe that every human on earth, with the exception of survivors, should visit the death camps. Why? Because it changes you. It cannot not change you. When you walk the grounds of Auschwitz, you become more empathic, more compassionate, and you have a greater understanding of what happens when evil that is unimaginable goes unchallenged. And so let me introduce our panelists to you who have made this trip. And I'm going to ask them a few questions, and you're going to hear from them why. And I think you'll find it very, very enlightening. The first panelist is David Ravanchana. I hope I pronounced it right. David grew up in Los Angeles, where I am right now, attended USC for both undergraduate and graduate degrees. He works in real estate development, and after going on his first trip with March of the Living, a program that years and years and years ago in Miami, I was part of founding, David was incredibly moved. Now, in his own time, he takes young adults on this journey. Brett and Shira Spector Brett is a Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships with Iron Mountain. He also is on the boards of directors of the Rosen JCC in Orlando and Congregation Oheb Shalom in Maitland. Shira is currently Chief Data and Analytics Officer for Partners Federal Credit Union. Shira and Brett met as volunteers for March of the Living and ended up getting married. They have 2 children, Mitchell and Andrew, and Shira and Brett have taken youth on several journeys now. Holocaust history is part of their regular conversations with their children. And finally, Leah Hornick. Leah is currently a student at Rollins College and a Bonners leader who volunteers her time with the Holocaust Center. After graduating high school, she lived in Israel for 9 months studying at Hebrew University. In this gap year, she had the opportunity to travel to Poland and learn about the atrocities that occurred there firsthand. So the first question I want to ask all of our panelists, let's start with you, Leah, is what motivated you to go on such an emotionally wrenching journey? What was the motivation?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you for everyone that's also here. It really is such a special day today, Yom HaShoah, so I just want to say thanks for everyone. I think one thing that motivated me is just the history and my ancestors. So growing up Jewish, you learn about the Holocaust, you learn about the past and things that have happened to your own family. And I think that it's something more to see with your own eyes. You have to learn about these things, and when you see them, sorry, it's so speechless when you're thinking about it. But in order to learn and reteach people, you have to go and see it for yourselves, and it's just eye-opening.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I want to get everybody's answer to that question. What motivated you to take your first trip? I can understand, I've been several times now, and once you've been there once, you're drawn to show other people what you've seen and have other people that you care about and love experience what you've experienced. But I want to get everybody's answer. David, let's go to you next on what motivated you to take your first trip.
I had always wanted to go in high school when it was offered at Milken, the high school I went to in Los Angeles, but my parents did not let me go. So I had been wanting to go since then, but like you, I am a student of World War II history, and I have a strong Jewish connection. So for me, it was the perfect mix of my love for history and World War II and my passion for Judaism, and I had to go experience it. And then just like everyone, once I did it once, I was sucked in and I was motivated to do something about it. So I'm sure we'll get there later.
And Shira and Brett, aside from being able to find a spouse, which is a great motivation, I guess, to go to Auschwitz. What was your motivation, both of you? And answer whoever wants to go first.
So I was running a youth group program at my conservative synagogue down in South Florida. I was running a USY and Kadima youth group for Temple Beth Am in Margate, Florida. So I was always working with my kids and things like that. And Yom HaShoah came around and our rabbi brought in a Holocaust survivor. And I didn't really know much about the Holocaust except what I've read and understood. But after I'd heard that survivor speak, as well as some of our USY kids, it had such an impact. And then one of my youth group kids came in like a couple of months later and she said, have you ever heard of this program called the March of the Living? Which I hadn't. And 4 of us from our synagogue went on the March of the Living for that trip. And that's really where it started to kind of create the path of like me learning about the Holocaust and really understanding what the Holocaust was and the impact that it had on our people. And as we studied and learned more and more and more, I got intrigued more and more about, just asking why this happened, how it happened, how we can't allow it to happen again. And then just when we got there, it just had a complete impact entirely because I was really there as Madrachim to really support the kids. And it ended up being a little bit of both. Like they were supporting me, I was supporting them. And it just overall was I hate to say like an amazing experience because it's not amazing, but just the foundation and what it brought to my life to be able to bring back home and share with my kids now is really where it's made a significant impact in my life.
Shira?
Yeah, and Mark, so I was a senior in high school in 1989 in Miami when this whole thing got started. And it wasn't in the cards for me to go that year. So it was something that was always in the back of my mind. My parents had actually been twice, my father as a doctor as part of the Miami delegation with the kids. And it just, the experience that they had and what they saw was always something that intrigued me. I had just moved back to South Florida from 6 months of actually living in Europe, and moved back to South Florida to my home. And just having that experience in Europe and coming back to the US and wanting to find a way to really have an impact in the community in South Florida and going through getting a new job and meeting new people, it was just felt like the right time for me to contribute to the youth in our county and to have this experience that I wanted to have, my parents had had, and lucky enough was where I met my husband. So, and
just an interesting tip. So Shira's parents are on this call. I was actually on the march with Shira's parents. I actually met them before I met Shira. So it was very unique and interesting.
Very Bashert story.
Yeah.
What a great story. Wow. And I've, that temple, Beth Am and Margate, I've spoken at so many times, and it was probably before you were a student there in Hebrew school or Sunday school, but I used to show my slides there from my journeys of conscience. So it's just it's a very small world.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, you've all been on these trips, and you don't go alone, you go with others. And I've led 3 trips, high school students, college students, and some with adults. And especially with high school students and college students, do you find that, like our trips, you form bonds, maybe not get married, but you form bonds with every single person on that trip that you're friends for life? I mean, Leah, you're still young, but for the rest of your life, you form these friendships because of the experience and how intense it is of going through Eastern Europe and experiencing the Holocaust with a group of people. And every other day, someone else is breaking down and being emotional, and the group comes around and helps them. Did all of you experience something similar? Anybody could answer that.
Yeah, so I actually went with my gap year program. My gap year program was about 90 kids big, and only about 20 students went. And our tour guide actually ended up being our program director. So it ended up being a very intimate time, a week and a half we spent in Poland with our program director and 20 of us. And just before this call, actually, I was reading through my journal that I had kept from Poland, and I was reading, and these, my best friends, like you said, still to this day, I remember making friendships on this trip that I hadn't made before the trip had happened. And the friendships that I had before the trip, I remember I would hold their hands walking into the camps, like I needed to hold my best friend walking in here, or even if my best friend was across the way, whoever was next to me, you just hold them and walk in. And I still talk to these same 20 people all the time. We still have a group chat 3 years later that we talk in every day. And these people that I was holding their hands, I talk to every day too. And it's an experience that you go through by yourself, but also with these people. And so I'm very grateful to have been with all these people and to have had an amazing tour and support system. So.
And have you maintained contact with them since you've been back?
Yes. I haven't seen a lot of them because we all live across the country and stuff, but we manage to WhatsApp and text all the time. So.
Anybody else want to take that question about bonding on a trip like this?
Yeah, I very much agree with what you said. I think because everyone is so exposed emotionally, it really opens you up. So you are able to create great bonds with people. So of my first group I led, which was 47 people, I don't know how many were married and how many were single, but let's say about 30 were single. We had 2 marriages come out of the group, and somebody married a sibling of one of our participants. So 5 out of 30 people resulted in some kind of marriage also. So as you can tell from Brett's story also, it's very common to create long-lasting bonds, if not marriage, at least very close friends for life.
Do you know that there's an extraordinarily high percentage of survivors who married other survivors? And the reason is, when survivors came out of the camps, only another survivor could understand what that experience was. It would be hard to come to America and explain to someone, here's what what I experienced in Auschwitz, because the psychological sensibilities are just not built to encompass something so radically outside of the ken of our normal experience. And so there's an enormously high percentage of survivors who married other survivors. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I think, obviously the kids that were in my group, they're obviously a lot younger than I am, but I do stay in touch with them. A lot of them are married now, they have kids, but my co-madrachim, who I was on my trip with, I stay very connected with and chat from time to time. But it's amazing where the path of life takes everyone, and it's always good to connect with people and reminisce. But it's definitely lifelong friends in some form or fashion.
Did all of you have at least one survivor on your trip?
Yes.
Yeah, so in South Florida, Brett and I were participants from 2 different counties, which is probably why we hadn't met each other before the trip. And yes, each one of our groups, which was about 40 children on a bus, had a survivor. So in our total, our delegation was probably 8 to 10 buses just from Dade and Broward County, and each one had a survivor with their own unique stories. The survivor with my group, it was her first trip back. And she was actually a survivor of Majdanek. And it was amazing to watch her retrace her steps in a way that was almost a little bit chilling. But the realization of she went one way and other people that she remembered went another way. Those people didn't survive and she survived, and watching her retrace her steps was really unbelievable. She wanted to be able to do that once in her lifetime, and to do it with our group was just amazingly special.
Yeah, and in my survivor, when we went back to the camp, she was a masseuse. She massaged people for 22 out of the 24 hours a day. She basically slept maybe an hour a day the rest of the time she had for herself. But when she walked into the room where she would actually be for most of her life, that during the time she was there, you can see, even though it was the second time she had been there, you can see she just kind of broke down that, really what took place so many years ago still had like a huge impact on her, which it should. But it's amazing the flashes that she had in her mind and what she shared, that she was touching other people that were doing all this hate and hurt in the world, and it made her sick and nauseous. So
it's so powerful when a survivor accompanies you, because I talked at the beginning about the empathy you develop on a trip like this, and when you actually stand there in Majdanek or Auschwitz with the survivor. In our case, 3 times we had the same survivor from Cleveland, a woman named Bertha Lautman, who had incredible strength. And she survived between the ages of 11 and 13, 2 years in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and took us right to the plank where she slept. And when you're standing next to the survivor and she said, "See this plank? This is where I slept for 2 years." It's just so powerful to be there in the presence of somebody who was actually there.
Yeah, Brett and I were talking earlier about other survivors that were on our trip, and we also had another survivor. He was with another bus, like we walked around Auschwitz in small cohorts, but I was kind of listening in on his cohort. And, we all see the train tracks that go into Birkenau, and we've seen them in movies, and it's nothing like you're standing on them. But he brought it to life a little bit more for the group that he was talking to. And he's like, right here, and it's grass, last place I saw my father. And you could see the look on the kids' faces that's like, oh my God, like last place I saw my father was, at home and, having a dinner or a family gathering, or maybe we argued or what, but to actually watch that connection between the survivor saying, this was the last place I saw my father, it really resonated with the kids in the sense that the relationships are so important and we can't take them for granted. And to kind of be in that spot and be their support for each other as they were sharing stories was really unbelievable.
How many of you visited Majdanek? You've all been to Majdanek. So back in the 1980s, and I don't know if it changed because I didn't go after the 1980s, but back in the 1980s, Majdanek was a very, very bizarre place. So many people perished there, and it didn't have the same installations as some of the other camps did. And so, and again, this is almost too macabre to say on a Zoom, but it is the truth, and so I'm going to say it. But when we were there, you could, 40 years after the Holocaust ended, you could smell the stench of burning flesh all over the grounds of Majdanek. You actually could smell that. And because of that, there were no other forms of life there. Other animals and other bugs and other birds and things didn't want to be anywhere near this smell. And so we tried an experiment where we sent one of the students to the very back of the camp, and we went to the front of the camp, and you could literally whisper and you could be heard because it was absolutely silent. Was it silent when you were there?
Yes.
So not only was it silent, but I remember very specifically pulling up to Majdanek, and the leader of our group on our bus said, it was actually an unusually warm day in Lublin in Poland on that day. And she said, because, you know, Majdanek is somewhat set down into the ground, like you walk down. And she goes, even though it might be like 10 steps, she said, it's about 20 degrees colder, 20 steps down. And we're all like, what, really? She goes, everyone take your jackets. Brett's wearing our March of the Living jacket. We have him here with us. Freezing. You walk 20 steps down into the camp, and that temperature changed, and it was really very surreal, and you could feel what happened there.
And you know, did any of the counselors on your trips make the point that if you and I, 40 years after the Holocaust, could smell certain things at this camp, then 40 years earlier, during the Holocaust, the people in Lublin and the people in Krakow who were close enough to the camp, they could not have not known what was going on there, because often you hear, oh, we didn't know what was going on in the camps, we had no idea. But how is that possible?
They
If
knew.
40 years later, you could smell things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that that stood out to me the most when visiting Majdanek was the neighborhoods and the city that you could see from standing in the camp. And Majdanek is one of the few that is still like intact. So some are demolished, destroyed, and you wouldn't even have known that there was a concentration camp there. But Majdanek is one of the few where the gas chambers are still there, the bunkers are still there, the watchtowers, everything's still there. And it's so surreal when you're walking and seeing this massive space while also seeing the city just going on, continuing behind. And I even have this picture that I took when visiting. Majdanek was also one of the camps where the Day of Harvest took place. So for those of you who don't know, about 40,000, I want to say, but I'm not sure, Jews were shot within like a 2-day period at across different concentration camps, one of them being Majdanek, where 18,000 people were murdered in one day. And at Majdanek, you can still see these mass graves that are untouched. And I have a picture of where this was with just the city behind. And I remember that's one thing I think that I took with me from leaving Poland was how could the city continue? How can all this stuff happen when all the atrocities were taking place right there and right in everyone's backyards and right in each other's neighborhoods? And it's something that I still haven't quite come to terms with, but it is quite interesting when you bring that up. Yeah.
The greatest Holocaust scholar of all time, a man named Yehuda Bauer from Israel, once said during the Holocaust, the entire world was divided into 3 groups of people: perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. And you didn't want to be any one of those 3 groups. You don't want to be a bystander. Absolutely don't want to be a bystander. I have some more questions for you, but there's a question in the chat that I'm going to stick in here now because my limited technical skills, if it goes above the line, I won't know how to find it again. So I'm going to ask it now because I think it's an interesting question. It's from Allison. Question for the panel: what does it look like to be an advocate for Jews and meaningfully continue the memory of the Shoah, the Holocaust, when you do not identify as a Jew and are not formally considered a Jew? I think that's an important question for the same reason that George Will, who's not a Jew, wrote that article and said we need a Holocaust Center, and 95%, 99% of visitors to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum are not Jewish. The overwhelming majority of people who visit are not Jewish. But do any of you have an answer to Allison's question?
Well, that's a big question and a really important one. I'll take a stab at it. You know, the Holocaust is, well, yes, it happened to 6 million Jews. It was fundamentally rooted in the notion of hate, and hate is something that is out there. It's still out there, and whether or not you are Jewish or not Jewish, the idea of what happened, as you said, Mark, at the beginning, when hate goes completely unchecked. This is the worst lesson, the way to learn that lesson in all of our history. And that's what I really love about a lot of the programs coming out of our Holocaust Center here in Orlando is using that platform to be able to teach future generations what happens when hate goes unchecked, using the Holocaust as that picture into that horrible lesson to be learned. You know, visiting then really creates even a greater level of responsibility, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, visiting there and telling the story and having it be part of our story as humans. And sharing what you've seen, what you've heard, the stories that you've heard. And that's really what this is all about.
And I think when you say 95% are not Jews, you know, visiting the Holocaust Center, I think that's really important. I think, you know, there's, you know, and I probably bucket into two different places. One, I think, is people visit because they really truly want to know if it truly happened and their understanding of it, to truly get educated, to say, hey, you know something? They built this museum. I'm coming to the museum. You know something? This really happened. And I think people today, as you know, still need validation to know whether it truly happened or not. And that's really, it's really sad to think that way. And that's how people think. But I think once they get that validation, I think it's like anything else. As stakeholders in this country, in this world, they have to continue to promote that message of that it happened, it could never happen again, and have a true understanding about carrying that message forward with a message of, you know, you truly understand what took place. Visiting a museum is just visiting a museum. Like, here's my $3 donation. I'm going to walk through and do whatever I need to do and say, hey, by the way, I visited the Holocaust Museum. That makes me, you know, I know what's going on. But really, truly understanding and taking the time, kind of like what Joel said about visiting Yad Vashem for his first time, and that message or that feeling resonating with you is something that every person in this world needs to experience and understand.
I couldn't agree more. As you know from the introduction, I had the real blessing in life to spend more than 30 years working with Elie Wiesel, and I have many quotes from him, but I have one that sits right on my desk in front of me every day. And I'll just share it with you because it relates to Allison's question. It says, if we have learned one thing from our past, it is that to live through dramatic events is not enough. One has to share them and transform them into acts of conscience. It's a very famous quote from Elie. And he used to always say that, you know, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. And so we can't be in this alone. If evil is ever going to be eradicated from our world, we need to share Auschwitz. That's why I said at the beginning, I think every human being other than survivors should take a trip like this. So along those lines, let me ask you, what did you see? What one thing did you see on your trip that really surprised you the most? For example, when I went to Anne Frank's house, I had read the Diary of Anne Frank, but I was so surprised at how small the actual secret annex was. It was extremely small. What one thing from your trip surprised you the most that you encountered? Leah, let's start with you and we'll go around.
For me, it was, I think it was the history and kind of the lost history, I think, that I didn't get the right education maybe about or couldn't understand until I got there. But the Jewish history that was thriving in Poland before the World War II came in the Holocaust is just really unimaginable and something I never could put into pieces. But when you go in Krakow, for example, we were talking about this morning, you can walk down the street and there'll be 7 different synagogues all on one block and all from different sects of Judaism, and just so much culture. And to think of like Krakow as this thriving place for Jewish life and Jewish thought, and now it's just gone and there's nothing there. It's really crazy. And to be one of the only Jewish students at my high school, one out of 4,000 students, and having only one main synagogue in Central Florida, maybe 2, and having, you know, becoming only this minority where no one, it's crazy to see that the life that was lived before the Holocaust took it was thriving, and that there could be 7 synagogues on a block. Yeah, just, you have to see it.
David?
I was surprised at how the more time you spent there and the more you learned about it, the more questions you had. It's such a complicated event, and you just need to learn more as you go through, and you realize that there's so much more to know, both about the scope of the crime, the cover-up of the crime, the efficiency of the crime, and how much you can learn about yourself and how you can recalibrate your moral compass, seeing the darkest part of history and some of the shining moments that came out of the Holocaust where people saved people. So there's just so much to learn about it, and you can just keep going deeper and deeper into it.
Another great quote that Ellie was famous for is he would always say that questions are more important than answers because they alone can be shared. But Brett and Shira, what did you find on your trips that surprised you the most, that you just weren't prepared to see?
So I'm going to revert back to Leah's comment earlier. I was really taken back how close communities were to the camps. It hit me in a way that like, how is this even possible? That you're a stone throw away from everything that took place and nobody said anything. Nobody alerted anybody. And I remember standing outside the camp, just like looking across the street for a period of time and like saying to myself, how could this have happened with all of this like, you know, it's like going around the corner to your cousin's house. Like, it blew me away. It really had it took me back.
And to your point, to bring it right to America today, did all of you see that news story a week or two ago about the man who was attacked outside of a building in New York, an Asian American, and people in the building saw it and nobody came to his aid. Nobody lifted a finger right in front of them.
It's crazy. It's awful.
Sure, what about you? What did you see on your trips that surprised you the most?
Well, I mean, I think I have to kind of agree with Brett. I mean, Majdanek is just so shocking for so many reasons. It could be functioning in 48 hours, right? Because it's all intact. And so that to me was just shocking to see. But the fact that there's a building right behind the wall, and from the 4th floor, even from the 3rd floor of that building, you can clearly see what's happening. I mean, that really brought it to life. I mean, you know, you visit Treblinka, it's in the middle of the field, in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, it's kind of hidden. If you wanted to commit a crime, you would do it where nobody could see it. But the crime of humanity that's sitting right in front of people's eyes was probably, and it was that kind of that comparison of the different camps and the different formats they took. It's as if it didn't really matter. It was in your face or not in your face. And the fact that it went on for as long as it did and took as many lives as it did was just, it's really a lesson for all of us when you see it, to come back and realize that what happened in New York, that can't happen.
Did all of you remember seeing at the museum in Auschwitz, there's a famous picture of the system of trains that led Jews, all over Europe. This amazing photo of all the different trains that led to Auschwitz. Well, one of the most stunning parts of that picture is the train tracks that go all the way down to Salonika, Greece, which is very far from Auschwitz, Poland. And yet the Jews in Salonika were transported to Auschwitz if they weren't killed in Salonika. Well, when they were transported by trains, the picture looks like a, Lionel train set or something, but in real life, trains just don't go on straight lines. They go over mountains and under rivers and around things and and they stop at all sorts of depots, and lots of people have to be involved for a train to get 1,000 miles. It doesn't go like a little train set. And so for someone to be on a train going to their death in Auschwitz from Salonika, Greece, all the way to Auschwitz, an awful lot of people had to be involved to make that happen. And when a train would get to a certain depot, you talk about resistance, whoever the station master was in that single depot, he could have just pulled a lever and sent it to France, or pulled a lever and sent it to some of the Germans weren't going to know, the Nazis weren't going to know that. He could say, oh, I made a mistake. But not once do we have one instance of a train that set out for Auschwitz with human victims that it didn't get there. And I don't know if you saw around Passover this year, people were circulating a piece of paper and an article about the grandson of a Jew from Salonika, Greece, who survived the Holocaust, survived Auschwitz, and his grandson is now the CEO and president of Pfizer and helped found the vaccine that is curing the world. The grandson of a Holocaust survivor.
Wow.
Let me ask you, we talked in the beginning about how a trip like this changes you. So dig deep into your souls, even though this is public and you're in front of a lot of people. In what ways do you think this trip has changed you as a human being? Who wants to go first with that one?
I can go with a less deep answer as a start. So when I went on the trip, I came back and I noticed that the vast majority of people on that trip were either high schoolers or much older people. And when I came back, I felt compelled to take people who are in their late 20s and early 30s on the trip, because those are the formative years of your life when you decide who you're going to marry, how you're going to raise your children, what moral things are important in your life. So I really wanted to make sure that people of that age group had an opportunity to go. So that's when I then decided to spend my time and take people to Poland in that age group. So it really affected what I'm passionate about in my life and how I spend my free time.
That's beautiful, David, because when you change a single life, you don't just change a single life. You change that person's child and that person's child and that person's child, and you change, just like when you give someone a scholarship to college that otherwise could not have gone, it changes generations after that. The paradigm is huge just to help one person. When you take one person to Auschwitz, the impact that one person will have on all the ripples in their lives, it's enormous. Leah, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so it's actually really deeply affected me because, just a quick, I guess, background. After Poland, so after my gap year, I go to Rollins College now. And I initially was a biology major, want to do science, all this and stuff. But, the world in the past 4 years and has just really been going in a direction that makes my stomach turn. And after leaving Poland, you can't leave Poland like we've been talking about. You can't leave Poland and just kind of go on with your life. You have to realize that, here's a quote, so from Elie Wiesel, since we all have been talking about him. One of my favorites is, he says, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. And I really take that to heart, because when I went to Poland, obviously not everyone gets a chance to go and not everyone can experience the things that I can, but my hopes is that I can bring my experiences and what I've learned and what I saw and bring it to wherever it needs to be, so that this hate in the world will be discontinued. Because the direction that we're going in, I mean, for example, like the bystanders that we're watching, like that we just said, the story that we've been talking about, it's still happening all around us, even today in 2021, the hate, it's just so upsetting to me. And so I've changed my direction and I'm no longer a biology major. I'm actually religious studies and political science, and I hope to continue Holocaust education, Holocaust research, because I really believe to become a witness and to be a witness, you have to learn about the atrocities, you have to educate other people, and you have to make sure that people won't let it happen again. It doesn't just mean that these gas chambers popped up overnight. Hate piled on for years and years and years with no one stopping it until it got to this point. And we can never let it get to that point ever again. So I hope for the rest of my life, I don't know what that means, but to be educating others about what I saw. And I hope to visit Poland again too soon someday. So.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up to that question. Everybody now has seen that famous picture of the person in the Capitol who was wearing the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. Do you think if somebody took that person to Auschwitz and showed them the museum and made them walk through the museum and focus on the eyeglasses and the suitcases and the human hair and everything, the cans of empty cans of Zyklon B, everything that you see in that museum. Do you think if someone lifted him up and took him to Auschwitz, that it might change how he acts in the world when he would publicly wear a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt?
Right. Personally, I don't actually. I think even taking someone filled with so much hate to a place like this won't do anything. But what I do, just because I think that their logic is probably like, this is fake or like whatever. So, but I think being able to relate to someone and speak to someone, I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't know, that people are crazy.
I mean, we've seen a lot of this kind of anti-Semitism comments, even in this, as you know, in the last several years in the sports world, in just the celebrity world. You know, like even Julian Edelman from the Patriots. You know, when there was some off comments made, he sat and he educated people. So, Leah, as much as I agree to disagree, I really do, and I think that's what all of our jobs are as Jews and non-Jews, right? To really educate people. But it's not just about, you know, when we think about the Holocaust and what impact it had on our lives, but even the experience that the folks that, you know, are survivors today, you know, the one thing that I took from, we had sharing sessions every night. Every night we'd sit in our groups. They would give us times during the day to write in our journals and get our thoughts together. And then at night we'd be in these sharing sessions, which at first when they told us in our pre-meetings that we're doing these sharing sessions, I'm like, come on, like, what are we talking about here? And then you get into it, right? And it really is something that's impactful, right? So, you know, some nights I spoke, some nights I didn't. The psychologist on my trip, so every group had a psychologist in case, you know, they needed a little bit more support. The one thing that he said to me, this wasn't to the group, but to me, he said, you know, as bad as life is to you, if something is going on in your life and you feel that you're in crisis mode or you're just feeling down, think about the people that were murdered in the Holocaust. As hard as life is for us, and it is, life is hard, especially in this day and age with COVID, but to put things into perspective that way, is life really that bad? In my opinion, it's not, compared to what the Jews experienced in the Holocaust. And I got to tell you, like, because I was going through some stuff at work and, you know, and I was sharing with him and it's like, it's really not that bad. It's really not. And that message resonated with me.
You talk about COVID and when people complain about having to stay home and in their, you know, fairly nice houses,
Yeah.
When it makes you think about Anne Frank spending 24 months in the secret annex, being silent, not just staying home, but being silent all day long with 7 other people. And you see how small the secret annex is. You know, COVID compared to the Holocaust is not much of a comparison.
We are very lucky in this day and age, in my opinion.
Sure. What about you? The question that I asked, it seems like a year ago now, but the same question to you.
Oh, wow. You know, I mean, my trip was a little bit different from other March of the Livings. My trip was the one trip that that did not go to Israel. It was in 2002 when there was kind of security issues in Israel, and none of the March of the Livings delegations went to Israel, at least we didn't, from South Florida, to really celebrate that euphoria of leaving Poland and going to Israel for Independence Day. And so our trip spent an extra 2 or 3 days in Poland. And I once recently heard a quote that I think, looking back and hearing this quote now, looking back, is really the impact that it's had on my life. I once heard a quote recently and said, you know, we always hear the saying, everything happens for a reason, but the quote was turned upside down for me and said, everything happens for an opportunity. And so for us, this whole notion of not going to Israel was very difficult because it's very hard to spend that week in Poland and not be able to celebrate Israel right after it, right? That was what we were all expecting and hoping for. In our 2 days extra that we spent in Poland, we wanted to keep the education and the experience going. And we were trying to figure out how to make this meaningful for the students that we were traveling with as an opportunity. to teach them about the Jewish communities within Warsaw. And we took them to some old parts of Warsaw, and we're in a couple of antique shops. And if you can imagine like what you find in antique shops in Warsaw, right? And in the specific one that we were in was myriad cabinets full of Judaica. And one of the opportunities was, wow, can we take this and give it a home? Can we bring some of this to our homes and put the Chanukiah or the soup ladle or the candles to use? And so while I was staring at this bookshelf of Judaica, I heard a scream from the other room. And what our trip was lucky enough to experience as this opportunity from not having gone to Israel was we found a Torah. We found a Torah in the back of an antique shop that was all by itself, was in very good condition, and we were able to rescue it and bring it back to the United States. So for us, you know, it brought meaning. Even now hearing this quote, everything happens for a reason, but it's really an opportunity to be able to do something special with that event that happened to you. And so for us, that's something that's kind of a mantra for me. We always say to our kids, everything happens the way it's supposed to, everything happens for a reason. But really, what's the opportunity that it brings for us? And so that's something, you know, a story that's amazing from our March of the Living, but it's continued to resonate with me.
Wow. Did any of you also visit Prague or Terezin? No, that's somewhere you should definitely go on one of your next trips. You know, Prague was where Hitler sent all of the valuable things that he expropriated from Jews before he sent them to the death camps. He collected all those things and sent them to Prague to create a museum after he was successful and after there were no more Jews in the world, called Museum to an Exterminated Ethnic Group. And there was so much stuff. I mean, jewelry and Torah scrolls and everything Judaica, and then pianos and Stradivariuses and everything of value, art that belonged to Jews, was sent to Prague, and it occupied 80 warehouses around the city. And then when, of course, he didn't win the war, they created the Jewish Museum in Prague, which has become what we call the Precious Legacy. And Terezin, of course, was the model concentration camp where they tried to fool the world thinking, you know, look how nice we're treating Jews, and it was just a ruse. But we've always added Prague to our trips because it's sort of a special place. Because the history, the oldest synagogue in the world goes back, the legendary Golem from the Altneu Shul is in Prague, and you can still go visit that. So it's an interesting place for you to add on your next trip. So I want to conclude by asking each of you one final question. Let me see if there's anything else in the chat. Just people praising you. And they should, because you are all very special emissaries. And Leah, you should be so proud of what you've experienced and what you're going to do with it. It's just amazing. And I can only imagine how many people you will affect as you go through life and share the stories and share the experiences that you experienced. So based on everything each of you has experienced, this is being recorded, so it's not even just for this audience, this audience is presumably, if they're on this Zoom, they care about the Holocaust, but it's being recorded, anybody could hear it. What message would you want to leave people with based on what you've experienced on these journeys? Anybody can go first, second, or third.
I'll start. I'll start with like a simple, maybe closing remark, but Serena had asked me what my favorite quote was before joining this panel, and I had told her that it was "Treat People with Kindness" by Harry Styles. But even though that's so simple and such a small quote, I really think that that has such a huge impact, even though it's such a small thing, just to treat people with kindness, but it could really go such a long way. And for so many different things, if we were all just a little nicer to people, I think this world would be so much different than what it is, and things could be solved. So.
Oh, that's beautiful. Very beautiful. And when, in a couple of minutes, when I introduce Johnny Daniels, you'll see the living example of somebody treating people with kindness who helped our people. So that's a beautiful sentiment.
I would add to that to also accept people who look different from you and are different from you. There was a lot of hate in that time in Poland because the Jews looked so different from everybody else, the way they dressed, the way they had their hair and things like that. So I think it's really important to understand that people look differently from you, and as we go through life, you should accept everyone even if they're different from you.
For me, it's the constant education for people. And that's the message that we also, you know, I went on a men's trip to Israel a few years ago. It's the message we preach to our kids that, you know, it's important to identify yourselves as Jews. And, you know, it's always an opportunity if there is anti-Semitism and it presents itself, there's always an opportunity to educate people in the right form and in the right fashion. And you should be proud of who you are and what your heritage is. And I think the constant education of everyone in this world is so crucial and so important.
And just to continue on that line, I mean, I'm always thinking of, you know, what we learned from the survivors and the people that experienced that horrible time. That's their story. And I often ask myself, and I ask our children, what's going to be your story? And we have the opportunity to write the story that the next generation is going to be able to hear about. And what impact can we have by learning from what happened and kind of write our own story for the future for others to tell. And so this is all one big story, right, of life and learning. And it's just what's our story now? And what are we going to contribute?
Well, you know,
can I add one more thing?
Absolutely, please.
If you're listening to this Zoom, or you will in the future listen to this recording, and you have not been on March of the Living or to Poland, I think it's important that you do go, because clearly you're curious enough, and it will change your life. A lot of people tell me if I take a week off work, I want to go to Hawaii and sit on the beach. I don't want to tour a concentration camp, but that won't change your life. And I promise you, this will have a very positive and meaningful impact on your life.
Well, David, you practice telepathy, because you took my closing words right out of my mouth. The 5 of us are part of a very special club, We've seen things and we've experienced things that are almost ineffable, almost beyond what human psychological understanding can comprehend, but we've experienced it. And we want everybody to join that club. We want everybody. Survivors don't need to, but everybody else, I think we want to be a part of the club that we're a part of, to go visit these places and bring back the sensibilities that they awaken in us. I had a trip planned last March for my 2 sons to take them to Auschwitz, and COVID happened. So we didn't get to go yet, but when COVID's over, we will go. And I just think that everyone, as you said, David, as you all said, should encourage our friends and our associates and certainly our children to take this pilgrimage. It's not easy, but life is not easy.
And if you're between ages of 21 and 39, you can come with me next year.
There you go. All right. My 2 kids are between those ages. Maybe I'll send them with you instead. Well, thank you so much. Brett and Shira, what a heartwarming story that you met as the result of this very special experience. And David and Leah, on behalf of everyone at the Holocaust Center, Resource and Education Center, I want to thank you for sharing and being so open with us. What you've done tonight is very, very special, and you have our gratitude.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Definitely.
So I'm now privileged to introduce you to another very special person who 7 years ago appeared in my office as a 27-year-old Israeli out of the blue. I don't think he knew what my previous career was. He needed a 501c3, and we provide 501c3s. I'm in a very different career than I was when I was a Holocaust scholar. And Johnny Daniels showed up, referred by a mutual friend, And he said, here's what I want to do. I want to take the entire Israeli Knesset. Every member of the Knesset will bring a survivor in their 80s. We will travel to Auschwitz. We will invite the governments of the world, and we will have the first official meeting of the government of the state of Israel outside of the state of Israel on the grounds of Auschwitz. And I looked at him and I said, and how are you going to do this? Who's going to pay for it? And he says, don't worry, I'll figure it out. 7 months later, it was 9 degrees below zero at Auschwitz on January 27th, and 4,000 people and the governments of 14 countries assembled on the grounds of Auschwitz. I'm tearing up just telling you about it. And he pulled that off. It was so cold, and that's really when you should visit Auschwitz, when you can feel what it was like, that when the chief rabbi of Israel, at the very back of the camp, when they have all the memorials in the 23 different languages, when he tried to blow the shofar, no sounds came out because it was 9 degrees below zero. But the event was absolutely one of the most extraordinary events I have ever attended. And it was because of this gentleman, his vision and his dream. And that night in Krakow, he got Andres Bocelli to perform at a dinner for over 1,000 people. And since that day, he has devoted his life to giving back, words that I love, to helping those who helped us in such profound ways. It's almost, words don't do it justice. And so let me introduce to you Johnny Daniels, who created the From the Depths Foundation with us. You know, we have many foundations and we're supposed to love them all equally, the way you would love all your children equally. But this one I love so much, and particularly because of the work that he's done in the world and because of how much it touches my heart. So Johnny, please share with us your amazing story.
Well, thank you so much. I should probably just let you carry on, Mark. But thank you. It's very kind of you. So I, as Mark mentioned, created From the Depths, my foundation, 7 years ago. I grew up in London, England, as you can probably hear from my accent. I hope it's easily understood by all. And I never wanted to go to visit the German Nazi death camps. I grew up, my great-grandfather, his entire family were murdered. They were from a small town in northern Poland. I grew up in London surrounded by Holocaust survivors. And my feeling was always that this would be too difficult for me to do. It would be too hard for me to visit such a place. I know, I've seen it, I've read the books, enough. And eventually, after I finished my high school in the UK, I moved to Israel, where I served in the army as a staff sergeant in the paratroopers. I finished my army service and started working in politics in Israel. And through many different circumstances, I ended up on my first trip visiting Auschwitz-Birkenau. And as so many mentioned before me, and as so many will be able to testify, it's a life-changing experience. When I was there, it hit me and impacted me in a way that changed my being entirely. My eldest daughter is named after her great-grandmother, a survivor of Auschwitz. I felt that I had to do more in terms of telling this story and in terms of making sure that my generation gets more involved. And not just involved from my perspective in sharing a post on Facebook or Instagram or maybe even a story on TikTok, but getting involved physically on the ground. And so we held this big event, as Mark said, where we brought the majority of the Knesset to Auschwitz, representatives from governments from all around the world. And what happened afterwards, for me, was more interesting. After this incredible event, many things started to unravel on the grounds in Eastern Europe. People started to come to us. We did a huge amount in the media. So I get a phone call saying, hey, Johnny, there's a park in the center of Warsaw that's built entirely with Jewish tombstones. I said, excuse me? They said, come have a look. Went to this park in the center of Warsaw, pulled away a brick, turned it around, there's Hebrew writing. Jewish cemeteries destroyed, tombstones repurposed, used for rebuilding all of Eastern Europe after the Second World War. This led us to discovering Torah scrolls, as was spoken about before, artifacts, drums, played in by bands that we opened and found that they were made from Torah scrolls. So much heritage and history just lying and waiting to be found. And it was a trip to Warsaw Zoo that was refurbishing. And once again, tombstones were found where I first came across the story of the Żabinskis, a story that many of you will be aware of because of the incredible movie, The Zookeeper's Wife. The Żabinskis were the zookeepers of Warsaw Zoo. And during their time, during the Second World War, during their time, they were able to hide over 300 Jews during the war. And this process and dealing and telling the stories of these righteous played a very different role in terms of how we also tell the story and educate in terms of the Holocaust. We worked with many celebrities over the last few years. I know that a lot of you will be watching this from Florida. We had the honor of taking NBA All-Star Ray Allen out to Poland just a few years ago. We had Mike Tyson, a well-known boxer, out with us about 2 years ago as well, where we visited the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial and uprisings and different sites. And when celebrities and heroes to many people like these are able to share those messages, it really expands and shares this message much broader than we're able to do within our small bubbles on social media or whatever we're able to do. And this was really our focus in terms of taking this message to a younger generation. And through the stories of the righteous, we're able often to speak about something incredible from such a dark and difficult time. Over 27,000 people were honored as righteous amongst the nations. Righteous amongst the nations, as many of you will know, are these non-Jews who risked their lives to save their Jewish neighbors during the war. It's something that many of us would assume that we would do as well. It's easy to look at these things and say, as many of you did before, well, they were just looking and didn't do anything. But what were you to do? It's often very, very easy to point and say, well, I would have done that. But would we have really? Now, after my experience and meeting families, and I could talk for a long time, I won't, of meeting families who were murdered, entire families, for attempting to save a Jew, you understand the absolute risk involved as well. And from these 27,000+, today, sadly, only 193 righteous amongst the nations are still alive. 193. Most in their 90s. And during COVID, we've changed a lot of the work of our foundation to be here on the ground in Eastern Europe to support them. When COVID started, I packed my bags and left my children in Israel, thought I'd be coming to Europe for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. A year later, I'm still stuck here, but stuck here gladly, because through this period, we've been able to be of service and help and support to the last living righteous. We've traveled over 100,000 kilometers, 18 countries, visiting them wherever they are, providing help, support, and showing love and care. And just recently, in partnership with the education center, I was visiting Belarus. In Belarus, there are 10 righteous living. Belarus is a tricky country to get to right now. I was actually meant to come to you live from Belarus this evening. It didn't happen because they wouldn't let me back in. That was because I made a bit of a hoo-ha when I was there the first time. It's my own fault, but what are you gonna do? And in Belarus, we went and visited the last living 10 righteous there. We went to them with food, with medicines, and with all we could to support and help them during this difficult time. And one of the ladies that we came across and went to visit was a remarkable lady by the name of Lubov. I was very excited to meet her. She lives in a small town called Glusk, which is about half an hour north of Bobruisk, a town that some of you may have heard of. In this small town, in 1941, when the Germans pushed the Russians out, they rounded up all the Jews. Over 3,000 Jews were pushed together and taken to a mass grave. a story that many of us would have heard of when they're shot one after another, falling into this mass grave on top of each other. And a young girl, an 11-year-old Olga, fell just before a bullet hit her. She laid in the pit, bloodied and covered with the bodies of her loved ones. After 2 days, she left the pit and wondered what to do. Everyone, everything she knew had gone. Olga managed to find her way to the home of Lubov. Lubov took her into her home and hid her with her mother and sisters for 3 years, saving her life. When the Germans came, Lubov would hide with Olga to make sure she wasn't scared. They remained friends, and sadly, Olga passed away just a few years ago. But Lubov is still alive. This 90-year-old hero is still living. And I went to visit her, as I do all the other righteous, came into her house with all these bags. And I was overcome with shock and horror at how she was living. I saw buckets and a smell. I didn't understand what it was. I asked the person who was helping me, and they said, "Johnny, that's her toilet." I said, "Excuse me?" They said, "Yes, well, there's no sewage here. She has an outhouse and it's difficult for her to get outside. She's 90. The house was freezing." This lady was living in abject poverty. A hero living left at 90 years old. So we were able to provide her with what she needed at that point, which was the medications. And over the last 4 weeks, we've been working tirelessly, which is why I look so tired, to make sure that we're able to help her and give her the dignity and support she needs. And just yesterday, with the help of notaries, because I couldn't get into Belarus, we signed on an apartment in the city of Bobroysk, an apartment that we've purchased for her, to enable her to live her last few years with the dignity and honor that she needs. Now, we're a small foundation. We do this because with the support of incredible people like Marc at the Giving Back Fund, who's just been a blessing to us, truly a blessing. And we fight and push forward every day. And once again, I could carry on for a very long time. I won't. We pre-recorded something from the last remaining wall of the Warsaw Ghetto that I know Serena will, I believe, play now. Dear friends, I'm coming to you today live from Warsaw, from one of the last remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto. I stand here today on Yom HaShoah, the day remembering the tragedies of the Holocaust and Jewish resistance. And as I stand here outside these very walls, where 78 years ago today, the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising took place, I'm full of so many incredible emotions. So many of you watching this would have wished to have been here right now. On a regular year, many of you would have come here and been able to pay your respects yourself. Today, I'm coming to you from here as your representative, as a representative of all those who wish they were able to come and remember, and in honor of all the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust. One of the strongest thoughts I have on a day like today, especially 78 years since the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, the stories that we've heard of Annie Levich and many others who uprose with all their might and did everything they possibly could to fight against the evils that the German Nazis and their collaborators brought upon us as a people. Often we think of the resistance as these people who fought then, as those heroes who stood picked up arms and fought. But the more time I've spent with my foundation from the depths here on the ground in Eastern Europe, speaking to survivors and righteous, I also understand something else, that resistance wasn't always fighting back. Resistance was sometimes just staying alive. Resistance was, as a father myself of 2 young children, my role wouldn't have necessarily been to have fought. It would have been to bring that little piece of bread to my daughters. That would have been my resistance. Resistance was keeping the decency that we've had as a people for thousands of years and not falling into the depravities and the difficulties of those times, to keep our heads upright as we could. And we saw that over and over again. We just finished the beautiful festival of Pesach, where 78 years ago, just before the uprising, Jews held the last Seder in the Warsaw Ghetto. That too was uprising. And I think that this point has really pushed even more forward with me, with my work and the work of my foundation, in supporting and helping the last living righteous amongst the nations. These 193 last living righteous, these heroes who stood as a beacon of light in these deep, dark and difficult times. These heroes who risked their lives to save the life of a neighbor. These heroes teach us so much, as do the survivors. And also the memory of those who perished, who were so brutally murdered by the German Nazis, gives us even more of a drive as a younger generation, as millennials, and as all of us watching, to make sure that we never forget. And make sure that this never happens again, not to us, but to any people. The story of resistance is a story of uprising. It's a story of morality in difficult times. And on this Yom HaShoah, when so many people are having hard times once again themselves, Holocaust survivors stuck at home in difficult circumstances, waiting, as I know many are, for their vaccines. With the righteous amongst the nations, this is going to be their second Easter all alone. This is our time to stand up and make sure that we do all we can to ensure that their memory is not forgotten. To push forward, to make sure that this past isn't just a book of history, isn't just something that's far on, but something that we take upon ourselves in remembrance always. From me here, outside, as I said, of one of the last remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto, I'll now light 6 candles. The 6 candles obviously representing the 6 million Jews murdered in the Shoah. And I'll light these candles tall and proud. I'll light these candles knowing that so many of you watching this around the world, that are great friends in Florida, that so many incredible people will too be lighting candles in your home. This light is a light that will shine. This light is an everlasting light. And that's our role, to make sure that the light from these times never goes out, that we always remember, that we never ever forget, never again.
Friends, Kaddish Yatom, which translates what literally as the orphan's Kaddish, but are known as the mourner's Kaddish, makes no mention of death, doesn't actually mention God's name. It refers to God's name with a capital N, but doesn't actually give us, does not invoke any of the traditional names of God. It is a doxology. It is a description of the praises and the gratitude which are due to God. So why do we recite this prayer as a memorial? Because it is forward-looking. It gives us hope. It reminds us that even at the most difficult times, we are not alone. Those who would like to, please recite with me now. Yitkadal v'yitkadash me rabba, Be'alma divra kirute ve'amlich malchute, B'chaye chon u'vyome chon u'vchaye dechol beit Yisrael, Ba'agala u'vizman kari vimru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach la'alam lamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei d'kudsha. Brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imrumav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Kay, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Lisa Bachman, and I am the Senior Director of Operations at the Holocaust Center. Dr. Hunter, thank you for the beautiful beginning to this program, and I would like to thank all of our panelists for the incredibly moving conversation. I know that I am ready to pack my bags and go and have that life-changing experience. Johnny, your story about Lubov was difficult, yet we're so thankful that you're there to take care of her and the many additional survivors and other righteous that you care for. Again, thank you, Rabbi Kay, for the meaningful recitation of the Kaddish. As part of our Yom HaShoah commemoration, the Holocaust Center has created a very special virtual tribute garden. We invite each of you to honor someone special to you. A donation to grow our garden in a meaningful way to support our mission while remembering or celebrating a survivor or a victim. Each of the flowers represents a cherished person, never to be forgotten. We'll be placing the link in the chat. I see Serena's already done it. The recording of this event is going to be uploaded on our website. It should be there within the next few hours. Please tell your family and friends who missed it to watch it later at their leisure. Clearly, our panelists have a lot of great advice for them. Our next event is coming up on April 14th. It's part of our Strategies for Action Lunch and Learn series. Because April is the Fair Housing Month, we've invited Sarah El-Badre and Yetzinia Negron to discuss the background of the Fair Housing Act, its implementation as law, its expansion to include greater protections, and ways that we can all further promote fair and equal housing opportunities for everybody. Again, Mark, Leah, David, Shira, Brett, Johnny, Rabbi Kay, and the incredible team behind the scenes. Thank you all for a wonderful evening and for helping us remember so many people and such an important event in such a significant way. And most of all, many thanks for all of you for being here with us tonight. Please enjoy the rest of your evening.